Story 1. The Silent Night. Introduction. It was a cold, moonless night in the small town of Harrowsfield, a place where time seemed to stand still. People moved through their daily routines without much thought, their lives blending into the slow rhythm of the world around them. But on this particular night, things would change forever. At exactly midnight, the air grew unnervingly still. A strange hum seemed to vibrate through the town, faint at first, but soon building into a suffocating silence. No sounds, no wind, no cars passing. Even the chirp of the crickets seemed to vanish. The most unnerving thing, however, was that everyone stopped. Absolutely everyone. People frozen in mid-action, mid-breath, locked in time. It was as if the world had stopped moving altogether. The freeze. Nathan Cole, a quiet and introspective man, was one of the few to notice the odd stillness first. He was walking home after an evening at the local tavern, his mind wandering through the mundane thoughts of his life. But as he turned the corner near the town square, he noticed something strange. The clock tower, which had always chimed loudly at midnight, remained eerily silent. He looked around, only to see the townsfolk in impossible positions, standing still in mid-motion, their eyes wide open, frozen with uncertainty. A woman was frozen mid-laugh, a man halfway through pulling a coin from his pocket, a child stuck in mid-run, all their faces caught in a strange mix of surprise and confusion. It was as if the world had been paused, and Nathan was the only one aware of it. Nathan didn't know how long he stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence around him was suffocating, a quiet that was deafening in its intensity. But what really terrified him was the realization. He was moving. His feet were moving, his heart beating, his lungs drawing in air. Everyone else, they were still. The revelation. As the night wore on, Nathan ventured further into the heart of the town, trying to make sense of what was happening. He stumbled upon the old library, a building few had dared to enter in years, its crumbling stone walls hiding long-forgotten secrets. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges creaking loudly in the unnatural stillness. Inside, the librarian, Mrs. Adler, was caught in the act of stamping a book. Her face was twisted in a look of surprise, but she was still. Nathan approached her cautiously, reaching out to touch her shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, her body shuddered, and for the briefest moment, she seemed to blink and move again, but only for a second. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Do not break it, Nathan," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible, as though it was a fragile thing that might vanish at any moment. "You don't understand the cost." Nathan recoiled, his mind racing. He had to know more. Mrs. Adler continued, her voice low, like a warning. "This silence, it's not just an accident. It is a curse, a pact made long ago by the founders of this town. A price was paid, and every generation since has kept the secret, kept the silence. But one person, just one, can break it. You've been chosen." Nathan shook his head, still not fully understanding. Chosen for what? What happens if I break it? She hesitated, then spoke the chilling truth. The silence is the price. The town was built on the souls of the lost, the forgotten. They demanded peace, and in return, the silence was born. If you break it, you will awaken them, the forgotten ones, and they will come for what they are owed. Nathan's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. The town, the people, everything he had ever known, it had all been built on lies. The struggle, determined to break free from the curse. Nathan left the library and rushed toward the town's bell tower, where the curse had begun so many generations ago. There, atop the tower, was the heart of the town's secret, the bell that had not tolled in decades. It was said that only when the bell rang would the curse be lifted, but it would come at a great cost. As Nathan climbed the creaking steps of the bell tower, he could feel the weight of the town's history pressing down on him. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the silence became, like it was suffocating him, dragging him toward an inevitable fate. Reaching the bell, Nathan hesitated. If he rang it, would it really break the curse? Or would it release something far worse? He gripped the rope tightly and pulled. The first tremor of sound cut through the stillness like a knife. The bell rang once, then again. The sound echoed out, breaking the unnatural silence. The world around him seemed to shift. At first, there was nothing. Then the air seemed to vibrate with a terrifying energy. Shadows began to move. Shapes appeared out of the darkness. Human forms that weren't quite right. Hollow, twisted. They were the lost souls, the forgotten ones, the price the town had paid. And now, they were free. Nathan turned to flee, but the shadows closed in. As they reached him, one of them, the figure of a young woman, spoke in a voice that was both ancient and hollow. You broke the silence, Nathan Cole, and now you belong to us. The price. Nathan fought back with everything he had, but it was futile. The shadows enveloped him, their cold touch seeping into his skin, pulling him into the depths of their curse. The last thing he saw before he was consumed by the darkness was the town, now slowly starting to stir as the silence began to fade. People blinked, gasped, and moved again, but none of them would ever remember what had happened. The silence would be forgotten, but the price would remain. Nathan Cole's name was erased from the town's memory, as if he had never existed. And so, the cycle would begin again. One man, chosen to break the silence, and one town, doomed to live in a fragile peace, unaware of the horror that lurked beneath. The curse was broken, but the cost was paid in blood. Story 2. The Lost Souls of Blackwood Manor. Introduction. Sarah and James Holloway were young, ambitious, and full of dreams. When they stumbled upon Blackwood Manor, an imposing mansion nestled on the outskirts of a sleepy town, they couldn't resist. It was the perfect project, a grand old house filled with history, potential, and the promise of a new life. The price was too good to be true, and that should have been their first warning. The manor had stood abandoned for decades, its walls crumbling and its windows boarded up. The rumors that surrounded Blackwood Manor spoke of hauntings, disappearances, and strange occurrences. But Sarah and James were undeterred. They saw only a beautiful, albeit decaying, house begging to be brought back to life. They moved in on a crisp autumn afternoon, excited to begin their new adventure. Their first night in the manor was quiet. The house was still, the only sounds the creaking of the old wood underfoot. Sarah and James spent the evening unpacking and arranging their belongings, marveling at the mansion's grandness, despite its state of disrepair. The next morning, Sarah discovered something strange in the library, a journal tucked away behind a stack of old books. It was dusty, its leather cover cracked with age, but the pages inside were still intact. She brought it to James, who was equally intrigued. They began reading the journal together, learning about the manor's previous occupants, Lord and Lady Blackwood, wealthy aristocrats who had lived in the house centuries ago. The journal described strange happenings, strange noises in the night, and a growing sense of unease. The last entry, written in a frantic hand, was incomplete. The portraits, they are not what they seem. They watch us. James frowned. What do you think that means? Sarah didn't know, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the journal was only the beginning of something darker. The portrait. That evening, they decided to investigate further. The manor's grand hallway was lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors, each with eyes that seemed to follow them. But one portrait in particular stood out, a large, ornate frame at the end of the hallway. It depicted a woman, her face pale and stern, her eyes deep and dark. She wore an expression that could have been sadness or anger, perhaps both. They had noticed the portrait earlier, but as they stood before it now, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the woman's gaze seemed different. The portrait almost seemed to shimmer, the shadows around her eyes flickering, as if alive. James was the first to speak. It wasn't like that before. The eyes, they looked more intense. Sarah frowned. I swear they weren't that dark when we first saw it, that night. As they lay in bed, the sound of the wind howling outside, the house seemed to settle in an unsettling silence. Sarah couldn't sleep, her mind racing. She found herself drawn to the hallway again, as if the house was calling her. She crept down the stairs, her heart thumping in her chest. The portrait, it was different again. The woman in the painting had changed. Her expression was no longer neutral. Now it was twisted in a grimace of pain. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth was open, as though she were silently screaming. Sarah gasped. "James," she whispered, her voice shaking. James appeared behind her, his face pale with shock. "That's impossible. We saw it earlier. It didn't look like this." They stood there in stunned silence, staring at the portrait, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. But the air around them grew colder, and a deep sense of dread began to settle in their hearts. The discovery. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and unease. Sarah and James began to notice other strange things. The house seemed to shift and change in subtle ways, like the walls were moving or the floors were breathing. Doors that had been closed were open the next morning. Objects they had left on tables would be found in different rooms. The feeling that they were being watched became impossible to ignore. But it wasn't until Sarah found another journal, hidden behind a loose brick in the library, that they learned the horrifying truth. This journal belonged to the woman in the portrait, Lady Eliza Blackwood. Eliza's journal spoke of a curse placed upon the manor, one that bound the souls of its inhabitants to the house. Each new occupant would be drawn in by the mansion's eerie charm, only to become part of the cycle, a cycle that never ended. The portrait, it turned out, was not merely a painting. It was a prison, a vessel that held the souls of those who had lived and died in Blackwood Manor. And it seemed that the souls of the past were still trying to escape. The house feeds on the living, Eliza had written, her handwriting shaking. We are trapped here. No one can leave. No one ever does. When the portrait changes, it means that the next soul has arrived. It will come for you. I can feel it coming for me. The price of restoration. That night, Sarah and James couldn't sleep. The house felt alive, its walls seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. They could hear whispers, faint voices, echoing through the rooms. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking just beyond their reach. They raced downstairs, their breath coming in panicked gasps, and froze in the hallway. The portrait of Lady Eliza had changed again. Now, her face was twisted in a grotesque smile, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was no longer alone. In the reflection of the portrait, a figure stood behind Sarah, a tall, shadowed man. His face was obscured, but his presence was overwhelming. James grabbed Sarah's hand, his voice trembling. We have to leave. Now. But as they turned to flee, they realized they couldn't. The door at the end of the hallway was gone. The once open doorway now led to a solid wall. The house had trapped them. A cold voice echoed through the halls, the same voice from the journals. You should never have come here, it whispered. Now, you will become part of the cycle, just like the others. The final choice. Sarah and James ran through the halls, searching desperately for an escape, but every turn brought them back to the same place. The grand staircase, the hallway, the portrait. The house had become a labyrinth of shifting rooms and mirrors, leading them in circles. They were no longer in control. As they reached the top floor, James stopped. His eyes locked onto the portrait in the attic, a newer painting of a young couple, eerily similar to themselves. It's us, he murmured, his voice hoarse. We're already part of it. Sarah gasped as she understood. The cycle was inevitable. No one left Blackwood Manor. The portraits would change again, and they would join the lost souls, bound forever to the house. Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in on them. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows around them thickened. They tried to scream, but no sound came. The last thing Sarah saw before she was consumed by darkness was Lady Eliza's face, now smiling, triumphant. Story 3. The Demon Beneath the Floor. Introduction. The Hawthorne family had always dreamed of living in a charming, peaceful home where they could create memories for years to come. When they found the century-old house nestled on the outskirts of town, it seemed too perfect to pass up. The house had a cozy atmosphere, with its creaky wooden floors, sprawling gardens, and high ceilings. It felt like a place where they could start anew, away from the hustle of city life. But from the moment they moved in, something felt off. The strange occurrences. It started small. At first, it was just the lights flickering on and off, the kind of thing that could be easily dismissed as a minor electrical issue. Then came the temperature drops, sudden, sharp gusts of cold air that would send shivers down their spines, even in the middle of summer. The family thought it was just old pipes or the house settling, but soon the sounds began. At night, when the family would settle down for bed, they would hear strange scraping noises coming from beneath the floorboards. It sounded as though someone was moving beneath them. At first, they assumed it was just the house creaking, but the noises grew louder, more distinct. It was as though something was scratching at the wood, trying to claw its way up from beneath. Anna, the mother, would wake up to strange whispers, soft but insistent, echoing through the house. They were never clear, but they felt like they were coming from right behind her, a breath on her neck, sending waves of dread through her chest. One evening, as the family sat in the living room, the air grew inexplicably cold. The fire in the hearth sputtered, and the windows rattled as if an unseen force was pressing against the house. Then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, moving across the floor above them. But there was no one there. "We need to call someone," Anna said, her voice trembling as she gripped her husband's arm. "This isn't normal." The paranormal investigator, desperate for answers, the Hawthorns called in a paranormal investigator, Derek Miller, a seasoned expert known for his work in troubled houses. Derek arrived late one evening, equipped with his usual tools: a video camera, EVP recorder, infrared thermometer, and an assortment of other equipment designed to capture the supernatural. As Derek stepped into the house, he paused, a strange look crossing his face. "There's a heavy presence here," he muttered, almost to himself. "It's like something's watching us." The family showed him to the room where the disturbances were most pronounced, the living room, where the coldness and noises seemed to originate. As Derek set up his equipment, he began to speak softly into his recorder, asking any spirits present to make themselves known. At first, there was silence. Then the temperature dropped significantly, and Derek's infrared thermometer flickered wildly. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The floorboards creaked beneath them, and the whispers began, low, unintelligible voices, barely audible. Suddenly, the video camera picked up a faint movement in the corner of the room. At first, It looked like nothing more than a trick of the light. But then it became clearer, a dark shape, almost like smoke, moving swiftly across the floor and then vanishing. Derek's eyes widened. This is bad. Whatever is here, it's powerful. He moved swiftly to the basement, where he felt the energy growing stronger. The house, it seemed, was built on more than just the remains of an old foundation. Derek's gut told him they were dealing with something ancient, something far worse than any ordinary haunting. The discovery. The next day, Derek conducted a thorough investigation of the property. He dug through old town records and discovered that the house had indeed been built on land with a dark history. Hundreds of years ago, the area had been the site of an ancient burial ground, an area where local tribes had buried their dead, and more disturbingly, a place where they had performed dark rituals, attempting to summon spirits from the beyond. It didn't take long for Derek to find what he feared most, a journal belonging to a long-dead priest who had lived in the area. The journal described a demonic entity, a creature that had been bound beneath the earth by the original settlers, its malevolent presence imprisoned for centuries. It was a demon of hunger, thirsting for souls, and the ritual performed to bind it had been forgotten over time. But when the land was disturbed, when the house was built on top of it, the demon had begun to stir. It was no longer bound by the rituals, and it sought its release. The footprints and strange sounds, it was testing the family, pushing them toward the breaking point so that it could fully awaken and claim them as its victims. The confrontation. Derek knew that they had to act quickly. The demon had begun to grow stronger with each passing day, its power seeping up through the floorboards, feeding on the fear of the family. He gathered the hawthorns in the living room and explained the gravity of their situation. "You've disturbed something ancient," Derek said gravely, "and now it wants to claim you. This thing isn't just a ghost. It's a demon, and it feeds on souls." The family was horrified, but Derek reassured them that there might still be a chance to stop it. With a ritual, an ancient rite of banishment, he could potentially sever the connection between the demon and the house. But it wouldn't be easy, and the demon would fight back with everything it had. That night, the family gathered in the living room, Derek standing at the center with candles lit around him. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were alive with malice. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Derek began chanting the incantation, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at him. The temperature dropped, and the shadows in the corners of the room stretched impossibly long. The floorboards groaned as if something was pushing up from beneath, and suddenly, the air was filled with a deafening roar, a scream that shook the house to its core. The demon had arrived, but Derek didn't falter. With a final, forceful shout, he completed the ritual. There was a blinding flash of light, and the house seemed to tremble as if it were coming apart at the seams. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a sudden crash, the house settled. The temperature returned to normal, and the shadows receded. The demon was gone, The aftermath. In the days that followed, the Hawthorne family felt the weight of what had transpired. The house, once a place of dread, now felt strangely peaceful, as if the air had been cleared. But the memories of what had happened lingered, a reminder of the dark force they had barely escaped. As Derek packed up his equipment to leave, he turned to Anna and her family, his expression serious. "The demon is gone for now," he said, his voice heavy with warning. "But be vigilant. Evil like that doesn't disappear easily. It's waiting. And if you disturb this place again, it will return." The Hawthorns moved out of the house a few years later, unable to forget what they had been through. They had narrowly escaped the demon beneath the floor, but they knew some things are better left undisturbed. And Blackwood House would always hold its dark secret, buried beneath the floorboards, waiting for the next unwitting soul to awaken it. Story 4. The Mirror's Curse. Introduction. Maggie Langston had always been drawn to the unusual, an avid collector of antiques. She spent her weekends rummaging through yard sales, estate sales, and flea markets, searching for treasures that spoke to her. When she found the antique mirror at a small yard sale in the outskirts of town, she couldn't resist. It was a beautiful piece, an ornate gold frame that had seen better days, with intricate carvings of vines and flowers along the edges. The glass was slightly clouded, as if the mirror had witnessed years of memories, yet there was something alluring about it. The elderly woman selling it, Mrs. Avery, seemed eager to part with it, and though Maggie felt a twinge of unease when she looked at the reflection in the mirror, she dismissed it as mere superstition. "It's a beautiful piece," Maggie said as she handed over the money. "I'll take it." The woman smiled, a tight, unsettling smile. "Be careful with that one, dear. Some things are better left alone." The first night, when Maggie placed the mirror in her room, she felt an inexplicable pull toward it. The light from the window cast a soft glow across the surface, and for a moment, the room felt warmer, as if the mirror had come to life. But that night, when she lay in bed, trying to sleep, something felt wrong. She could hear faint whispers, low, guttural murmurs, as if coming from the depths of the mirror itself. At first, she thought it was the wind or her imagination, but then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection, there was a figure standing just behind her bed, though she had not moved, nor had anyone entered the room. The figure was a twisted, distorted version of herself. Her reflection was smiling, but it wasn't her smile. It was cruel, mocking, with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. Maggie turned quickly, but the room was empty. She felt the cold fingers of fear brush against her spine. Her reflection had begun to change. The descent. Over the next few days, Maggie became increasingly obsessed with the mirror. Each time she passed by it, she couldn't resist taking a glance. And each time, she saw something new, something more horrifying. One evening, as she gazed into the mirror, she saw her reflection standing still, her eyes wide and unblinking. But then it began to twist. the face contorting unnaturally, her smile turning into a grimace of pain. The reflection whispered in a voice that wasn't her own, a voice filled with malice and longing. "Help us! Help us!" Maggie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice seemed to come from deep within the glass, as if the mirror itself was alive. The reflection moved closer, its features becoming more grotesque by the second. Terrified, Maggie stumbled backward, but when she turned away from the mirror, the whispering continued, filling her ears, echoing through her mind. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. There were others, too. Faces that were unfamiliar, distorted, eyes wide with terror. And they were watching her, the whispering faces. Maggie tried to ignore it. She tried to push it out of her mind, but every time she walked into the room, the mirror beckoned her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, more frantic, and with each passing night, the reflections became more disturbing. One morning, as she prepared for work, she noticed something chilling. There were scratches on the surface of the glass. Thin, sharp scratches, as if something had been trying to escape. That night, the mirror's grip tightened. As Maggie lay in bed, she saw it again, the twisted, broken image of herself. But this time, the reflection didn't speak to her. Instead, the faces of the dead appeared around her, their eyes hollow and pleading. They reached out, their hands pressing against the glass, their voices growing louder, more desperate. "Help us! They're coming for you. They'll take you too." Maggie's breath hitched. The faces were now pressing against the glass, their fingers reaching out, distorting the reflection further, becoming more monstrous with each passing moment. She realized then that the mirror was not just showing her twisted versions of herself. It was showing her the spirits of the dead, the dark secret. Desperate for answers, Maggie visited Mrs. Avery, hoping to learn more about the mirror's history. When she arrived at the old woman's house, the air was thick with tension. Mrs. Avery answered the door, her expression dark and grim. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked before Maggie could even speak. Maggie nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "What is happening? What's wrong with the mirror?" Mrs. Avery sighed and motioned for Maggie to sit. "That mirror," she began, her voice low, "has a dark history. It was created long ago by a man named Alistair Grieve, a renowned occultist. He dabbled in dark magic, seeking to bind the souls of the dead to objects, trapping them in mirrors, to use their energy for his own gain." Maggie shuddered. "So, the people I see in the mirror, they're all dead?" "Yes," Mrs. Avery replied. "Their spirits were bound to the mirror in horrific rituals. But something went wrong. The magic backfired, and instead of controlling the souls, the mirror became a prison, a place where the trapped spirits are forced to live in torment, and they can never escape unless they have a new victim to take their place." Maggie's heart sank. "You mean they wanted to take their place?" "Yes," Mrs. Avery confirmed. "That's why they whispered to you. They're trying to pull you in, drag you into the mirror so that you can take their place in the curse. You must destroy the mirror before it's too late. The final struggle. Maggie rushed back to her house, panic rising in her chest. She had to destroy the mirror before it was too late. But when she entered her room, she froze. The mirror was different. The reflections were no longer just twisted versions of herself. They were reaching through the glass, their fingers scratching at the surface, their faces contorted in agony. "Help us now." The voices were louder, more desperate, and Maggie felt the cold, unseen hands brush against her skin. She could feel the pull, like 1,000 invisible ropes dragging her toward the mirror, toward the darkness. With a cry of fear, Maggie grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, but the spirits inside screamed, their voices rising to a maddening crescendo. As the mirror shattered, the room seemed to shake, the air thick with a suffocating presence. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, just as quickly the cold air lifted, the whispers stopped. The oppressive weight that had settled over Maggie for days disappeared. She stood in the wreckage of the broken mirror, panting, heart racing, her body drenched in sweat. The spirits were gone. The aftermath. Maggie moved out of the house soon after, unable to shake the memories of the mirror and the twisted faces that had once stared back at her. She never spoke of it to anyone, afraid that if she did, the curse would return. The house was sold to a new family, and over the years, Maggie heard rumors that the mirror had resurfaced at another yard sale. But she couldn't bring herself to investigate. As for the spirits trapped in the mirror, Maggie could only hope that they had finally found peace. But deep down, she knew that there were some curses that never truly ended. Some mirrors held more than just reflections. They held darkness, and it was always waiting for the next soul to claim. Story 5. The Children's Lullaby. Introduction. Isabel Carter never thought she would lose her daughter, Lucy. But the unthinkable happened. Lucy, just 5 years old, passed away in a tragic accident. An innocent slip on the stairs. An accident that could have been prevented. The pain of that loss was more than Isabel could bear. She tried to go on, for the sake of her husband, Thomas, and for her own sanity. But the house that once held so much laughter and joy now felt hollow, suffocating. In the months that followed, the house seemed to mourn with her. The walls felt heavier, as though they, too, were grieving the loss of a young life too soon extinguished. And then one night, Isabel heard it. The first night, it was faint at first, like a whisper caught in the wind. The soft melody of a lullaby, a song Isabel had sung to Lucy since she was an infant. It had always been their song, one that lulled Lucy to sleep each night. The lyrics so familiar they were etched into Isabel's very soul. Isabel froze in bed. She was sure she was dreaming, her mind playing tricks on her in the darkness. But as the song grew louder, she could hear it clearly. It was coming from Lucy's room. "Lucy," she whispered, her voice breaking. She felt the air grow cold around her. "Is that you?" The song continued, soft and soothing, but eerie in its stillness, like an echo from another world. Isabel's heart began to race. She couldn't bring herself to move, couldn't bring herself to go into the room. But as the lullaby continued, drawing closer with each note, she finally forced herself to rise. She stumbled down the hallway toward Lucy's room, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. The song stopped abruptly. There was nothing. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the voice to return, but the silence was deafening. The room was as she had left it, dusty, untouched, a shrine to her lost daughter. Isabel stood in the doorway, trying to convince herself that the voice had been a dream. But deep down, she knew it hadn't been. The growing presence. Over the next few nights, the lullaby came back, growing louder and clearer each time. Isabel would hear it in the dead of night, soft at first, like a distant hum, but drawing closer as if the singer were moving toward her. It came from Lucy's room, but when Isabel opened the door, there was never anyone there. The voice, though, felt wrong. It was still the same song, but it was no longer filled with the warmth it once had. The voice sounded colder, distant, and as the days passed, the tone grew unsettling, filled with an unnatural sweetness, a haunting quality that sent shivers down Isabel's spine. One night, the lullaby was so close that Isabel could feel the air around her vibrate with it. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to find out who or what was singing the song. She stepped into Lucy's room, her heart pounding. The room was bathed in moonlight, the soft glow illuminating the shadows cast by the furniture. The melody echoed through the stillness, but no one was there. Isabel turned in circles, searching every corner of the room, and then she saw it. At the foot of the bed, just beside the crib, there was a shadow, the shape of a small child, standing still, as if waiting. "Lucy," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The shadow slowly turned toward her. It was no longer the shape of a child. It was something else, something wrong. Its features were distorted, like a reflection warped in water, and its eyes were black, empty voids. The lullaby stopped abruptly. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, her heart racing, her hands shaking. And then the thing in the corner began to move, gliding toward her with unnatural speed. Isabel froze, unable to scream as it came closer, its form shifting with every step. "Lucy," she managed to choke out, her voice a whisper of desperation. The thing tilted its head, as if contemplating her, its hollow eyes burning into her. And then, in a voice that was not her daughter's, it spoke. "Lucy is gone. I am here now." The truth behind the lullaby. Isabel ran from the room, slamming the door behind her, but the song began again, louder, closer, as if it were following her through the house. She couldn't escape it. She knew then that the voice wasn't her daughter. It was something else, something malevolent, something that had taken Lucy's place. The next morning, Isabel couldn't bring herself to leave her room. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She couldn't understand it. Why would this thing mimic her daughter? Why the lullaby? Then, she remembered something her mother had told her long ago, an old legend, a tale of spirits that could imitate the voices of the dead, luring their loved ones in, feeding off their grief and their pain. A spirit that could steal the soul of the living if it could convince them to embrace it. Her blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. The voice, the presence, it wasn't just a ghost of her daughter. It was a malevolent entity, one that had taken Lucy's spirit and was now using the lullaby to lure Isabel into its grasp. The thing that haunted her room wasn't her daughter. It was a demon, a creature born of grief, feeding on her sorrow and manipulating her emotions. And now it wanted her too, the desperate search for peace. Isabel couldn't allow this to continue. She needed to find a way to banish the thing that had taken her daughter's place, to reclaim the peace she had lost. Desperate, she turned to an old family friend, a spiritualist named Marisol, who had helped her mother many years ago with a similar situation. Marisol arrived late that afternoon, her presence calm, yet filled with authority. She asked Isabel to recount everything that had happened, listening carefully before nodding grimly. "You're dealing with something far darker than a simple ghost," Marisol said softly. "This thing has taken Lucy's form, feeding off your pain. It wants you to follow it, to give in to the grief. It feeds on the broken heart of a mother who cannot let go. But how do I stop it?" Isabel asked, her voice filled with desperation. "We must confront it. You must show it that your love for Lucy is not bound to grief and sorrow. It is a force that transcends death," Marisol said, her eyes serious. "The lullaby is your connection to Lucy. We'll use it to draw the spirit out." That night, Isabel stood in the middle of Lucy's room, Marisol beside her. The lullaby began again, soft at first, then growing louder. Isabel closed her eyes, letting the song fill her heart. She remembered the way Lucy had once sung it to her, the way it had always comforted them both. As the song reached its peak, Isabel spoke aloud. "Lucy, I love you, but you are gone. You are free. You must rest." For a moment, there was nothing. The room grew still, the air heavy with tension. Then, the presence stirred, and the creature stepped forward, its form shifting violently, its twisted face showing through the shadows. "I will not let you go," the creature hissed. But Isabel stood firm, her heart steady, her love for her daughter strong. "You cannot take what you never had. Lucy is my daughter, and she is at peace." With those words, a wave of light filled the room, and the thing shrieked in agony. It dissolved into the air, vanishing into nothingness. The aftermath. The lullaby stopped, and for the first time in months, Isabel felt the weight lift from her chest. The house grew quiet, peaceful, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. The next morning, she stood in Lucy's room, looking around at the empty walls, the toys left behind. She finally understood. The grief, the longing, it would always be there. But her love for Lucy was something more than sorrow. It was a bond that death could not break. Isabel knew that Lucy's spirit was free, and with that realization, she found peace. The lullaby would always be a part of her, but now it was a memory of love, not of loss. Story 6. The Dollmaker's Curse. Introduction. Olivia Hartley was an antique collector with a passion for rare and unusual items. Her home was a labyrinth of treasures she had gathered over the years, each piece telling a story, each artifact a link to a past she loved to explore. But it was in a small, quiet town on the outskirts of nowhere that she found her most peculiar acquisition, a rare, exquisitely crafted doll. The doll was a masterpiece. Its porcelain skin was flawless, and its glass eyes gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. It seemed to follow Olivia wherever she went, its gaze fixed and unblinking. Its delicate clothes were made from fine lace and silk, each stitch meticulously crafted. Olivia knew instantly that this was a rare find, one that would complete her collection. But as she paid the old shopkeeper and left with the doll, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The town felt eerily silent, like it was holding its breath. And when Olivia placed the doll in her car, it was as though the very air had grown colder. The strange events. That night, when Olivia returned home, she set the doll carefully on the shelf in her study. It was positioned just so, its eyes staring straight ahead. The moment she did, a strange chill swept through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. At first, she dismissed it as a draft, or perhaps her imagination playing tricks on her. But the next night, the lights in her house began to flicker. It started in the study where the doll sat and quickly spread throughout the entire house. Olivia would enter a room only to find that the light bulbs above her head would flicker and buzz as though struggling to stay on. At first, she thought it was an electrical issue, but the phenomenon grew worse with each passing night. Then, the objects began to move. A small vase that Olivia had placed on a side table suddenly toppled over, even though no one had touched it. Books slid off shelves, and the sound of soft footsteps echoed through the house when no one was there. Each night, the disturbances grew stronger, more unnerving. But it was the coldness that unsettled her the most. It was as though a presence had taken up residence in her home, invisible but undeniable. The air in the room became thick, heavy, and suffocating. Olivia couldn't explain it, but she couldn't ignore it either. The research. Desperate for answers, Olivia decided to do some research on the doll. She knew the town where she had bought it was small, but she was certain that something about the doll didn't sit right. She scoured the internet, visited local libraries, and even consulted old town records. After days of digging, she stumbled upon a name, a man by the name of Victor Devereux. a doll maker who had once lived in the same small town. Devereux had been known for his uncanny ability to create dolls that seemed lifelike, but his talent had come at a great cost. According to the stories, Devereux had infused each doll with the essence of a child, capturing their souls and trapping them in porcelain bodies. But the stories grew darker. It was said that Devereux had lost his sanity and, in a twisted act of desperation, had trapped the soul of a young girl, the daughter of a local couple, inside a doll. Shortly after, the girl's mysterious death occurred, and the town began to whisper that Devereux's dolls were cursed. As Olivia read more, she discovered something even more chilling. The doll she had bought was one of Devereux's creations, the last doll he had ever made before his death. The eyes that seemed to follow her, the cold presence in her home, and the strange disturbances. She had unknowingly welcomed the soul of a child into her life, a soul that had been trapped for over a century. The dollmaker's workshop, desperate to understand what was happening and to stop the curse before it claimed her, Olivia decided to visit the workshop of Victor Devereux. The place was abandoned, long forgotten by the town. It stood at the edge of a forest, surrounded by overgrown weeds and trees that seemed to close in on it. The building was decrepit, its windows shattered, the roof sagging with age. Olivia stepped inside, her heart racing as the air grew even colder. The workshop was dark and dusty, but it was clear from the remnants of tools, threads, and half-finished dolls that Devereux had once poured his soul into this place. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she moved deeper into the workshop, and the eerie stillness was broken only by the sound of her own breath. She soon discovered a hidden compartment in the back of the workshop. Inside, she found a collection of journals, yellowed and worn with age. The journals chronicled Devereux's descent into madness, his obsession with capturing the souls of children. But there, among the pages, Olivia found the truth. Devereux had made a deal with a dark force, a demon who promised him eternal life in exchange for the souls of the children he trapped. Each doll he created was a vessel for these lost souls, and they were forced to live forever in their porcelain prisons, unable to escape. But there was a twist to the curse. The soul that Devereux had trapped in the final doll, the one Olivia had purchased, had been the last to be created. It was a soul that had never been freed, one that had been waiting, restless, for someone to release it. The curse unleashed. With the chilling truth in hand, Olivia realized that the doll was not merely haunted. It was the vessel of a trapped soul, a child's soul that had been tortured for far too long. And now the soul was angry. The doll had been waiting for someone to find it, to set it free. As Olivia turned to leave the workshop, a shadow fell over her. The doll's glass eyes seemed to glow in the dark, and she could hear the faint whisper of a child's voice, calling to her, beckoning her to return to the house. The temperature plummeted, and the doors slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. Suddenly, the walls of the workshop seemed to come alive. Dolls, hundreds of them, rose from the shelves and tables, their eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. Olivia knew then that she was not just facing a curse, but the very soul of the dollmaker's twisted legacy. With no time to lose, Olivia ran for the door, but the dolls blocked her path, their eyes following her every move. She reached the door just as it began to creak open, but before she could escape, she felt a hand, a cold, skeletal hand, reach out and grasp her arm. She screamed, but the voice that responded wasn't her own. "You will join us," the voice hissed, echoing through the workshop. "You will never leave." In that moment, Olivia realized the terrifying truth. There was no escape. The dolls were the souls of the children, bound by the curse, and she was about to become one of them. Conclusion. When the townspeople found Olivia's body days later, they said she had died of fright. But those who dared to enter the dollmaker's workshop would tell a different story. How they heard the faint whispers of a child's lullaby, and how they saw Olivia's eyes, wide and glassy, staring back at them from the shelf, forever trapped in porcelain. The dollmaker's curse was not broken. It had only claimed its newest victim, and now Olivia's soul would join the collection, forever watching, forever waiting. Story 7. The Blackstone Inn. Introduction. The rain began just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the winding mountain road in hues of gray and shadow. Emma and David, weary from hours of driving, were relieved when they spotted the illuminated sign for the Blackstone Inn. The inn, nestled in the woods, exuded an old-world charm with its Victorian architecture and soft, golden lights glowing in the rain. "This place is perfect," Emma said, clutching David's arm. "It's exactly the kind of historic spot I love." David nodded, though something about the inn unsettled him. The towering structure seemed to loom over the forest, and its windows gleamed like watchful eyes. The arrival. Inside, the inn was warm and inviting. The lobby boasted intricate woodwork, a crackling fireplace, and the scent of lavender and aged wood. The receptionist, an older woman named Mrs. Delaney, greeted them with a pleasant, albeit slightly strained smile. "Welcome to the Blackstone Inn," she said. "We're honored to have you. Your room is ready. Suite 7 at the end of the second-floor hall." As they ascended the grand staircase, Emma marveled at the details, the antique chandeliers, the faded yet elegant wallpaper, and the portraits lining the walls. Yet, as they passed one painting, David swore he saw the eyes shift slightly, following their movement. When they reached their room, they were surprised by its beauty. The suite was spacious, with a 4-poster bed, a clawfoot tub, and a balcony overlooking the misty woods. But despite its charm, the air felt unusually cold, and shadows seemed to linger in the corners. The first night, as the couple settled in, the oddities began. David noticed the faint sound of footsteps pacing outside their door, though no one was there when he checked. Emma heard muffled whispers coming from the adjoining room, but Mrs. Delaney had mentioned they were the only guests on the second floor. By midnight, the whispers grew louder, interspersed with the distant sound of crackling flames. Emma and David exchanged uneasy glances, but neither wanted to admit their growing fear. They tried to sleep, but the oppressive feeling of being watched kept them tossing and turning. The other guests. The next morning, during breakfast in the dining hall, Emma and David met a few other guests. There was a cheerful older man named Mr. Thompson, a young couple celebrating their honeymoon, and a somber woman who introduced herself as Lydia. The interactions felt off. The guests spoke in peculiar, formal tones, as if plucked from a bygone era. Mr. Thompson's anecdotes about his travels seemed dated, and the honeymooners' attire appeared vintage, more suited to the early 1900s. Lydia, however, said little, her haunted eyes locked on the flames in the fireplace. "I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong here," Emma whispered to David as they returned to their room. That evening, they noticed the other guests behaving oddly. Mr. Thompson repeated the same story from breakfast word for word. The honeymooners danced in the ballroom to music that seemed to play from nowhere. Lydia sat in the lobby, weeping softly as she stared at a locket. The truth about the inn. Determined to uncover the mystery, Emma and David explored the inn. In the attic, they found old newspapers and photographs detailing the Blackstone and its tragic past. The inn had once been a grand hotel, renowned for its opulence and luxury. But in 1905, a devastating fire consumed the building during a lavish New Year's Eve ball. Dozens of guests perished, their souls trapped within the burning walls. Among the items, they found a ledger listing the names of the guests who had died that night. Shockingly, the names matched the people they had met. Mr. Thompson, the honeymooners, Lydia. All of them were victims of the fire. Realization struck. The Blackstone and wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for the souls of those who had died in the fire, forcing them to relive their final hours in an endless loop. The curse revealed. That night, the atmosphere in the inn grew oppressive. Shadows flitted across the walls. Whispers echoed louder, and the temperature plummeted. Emma and David tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge, and the windows wouldn't open. It was as if the inn itself had come alive, determined to keep them there. Desperate, they sought out Lydia, who seemed to possess a glimmer of awareness about their plight. In a trembling voice, she revealed the curse. The fire had been no accident. The inn's owner, obsessed with creating the perfect New Year's Eve spectacle, had locked the doors to prevent anyone from leaving during the celebration. When the fire broke out, there was no escape. "The only way to break the curse," Lydia whispered, "is to uncover the truth and bring justice to the souls trapped here." Breaking the curse, Emma and David ventured into the basement, where they found the remains of the inn's original foundation. There, they discovered a journal belonging to the inn's owner. The journal detailed his obsession with perfection and his horrifying decision to lock the doors, condemning everyone inside to their fate. As they read the final entry, the whispers around them turned into screams, and the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke. The spirits of the victims materialized, their faces twisted in anguish. The fire roared to life once more, consuming the walls and floorboards. Emma and David clutched the journal and shouted the truth into the chaos. You were betrayed. The fire wasn't your fault. The owner condemned you all. As the words echoed through the flames, the spirits paused, their anguished faces softening. One by one, they began to disappear, their forms dissolving into light. The escape, the fire extinguished itself as suddenly as it had appeared. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the inn seemed to exhale, its walls sagging with relief. Emma and David found themselves standing in the ruins of the original Blackstone Inn, the modern guest house facade gone. When they emerged into the fresh air, dawn was breaking. They looked back to see the inn crumble into dust, leaving nothing but an empty clearing in the woods. As they drove away, Emma and David felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. They had survived the Blackstone Inn and freed the trapped souls, but the memory of the haunted guest house and the shadows that had watched them would stay with them forever. Story 8. The Cursed Painting. Introduction. Alex Moore was a devoted art enthusiast, always hunting for unique pieces to add to his growing collection. When he attended a local auction one stormy afternoon, his eyes fell on a painting unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was a vintage oil painting of a serene countryside, rolling green hills, a quiet river winding through the land, and a pair of figures standing near a distant oak tree. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and the tranquility of the scene seemed to draw Alex in. Without hesitation, he placed the winning bid and brought the painting home. It wasn't until the painting was hung in his living room that Alex began to notice the subtle unease it brought. The air felt heavier, and the room seemed darker, as though the painting had absorbed some of the light. Dismissing the feeling as his imagination, Alex went to bed, content with his new prize. The changes begin. The next morning, Alex walked into his living room and froze. Something about the painting was different. The once bright greens of the hills seemed muted, almost gray. The river, previously clear and inviting, now looked stagnant and murky. He shook his head, chalking it up to poor lighting or a trick of his memory. But the changes didn't stop. Each day, the painting grew darker and more foreboding. The hills were now barren, the oak tree skeletal, and the figures, once vague silhouettes, became more defined. They were a man and a woman, their faces turned away as though hiding something. Then one evening, Alex swore he saw the figures move. It was subtle, a tilt of the man's head, the woman's arm reaching toward the river. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and stared at the painting, but the figures were still. The artist's dark past. Unnerved, Alex decided to research the painting's origin. He found that it was the work of a renowned artist, Victor Lavelle, celebrated for his ability to imbue his landscapes with an eerie realism. But Lavelle's life had ended in tragedy. His wife and daughter had mysteriously disappeared, and shortly after, Lavelle was found dead in his studio, surrounded by unfinished canvases. Rumors swirled that his grief had driven him mad, and that his final works were cursed, trapping fragments of his tormented soul. The painting Alex now owned, titled The Portrait of Tragedy, was Lavelle's last completed piece before his death. It was said to depict the very place where Lavelle's wife and daughter were last seen, a serene landscape now tainted by unspeakable loss, the descent into madness. As the days passed, Alex's grip on reality began to slip. The figures in the painting became more active, their movements unmistakable. The man would gesture toward the barren oak tree, and the woman seemed to wade deeper into the dark river, her face now partially visible, a mask of sorrow. Alex started hearing whispers at night, faint and mournful, echoing through the house. Sometimes he would wake to find the painting's figures staring at him, their hollow eyes accusing. The serene landscape had transformed into a nightmarish wasteland, the river a black void, and the oak tree gnarled and claw-like. Desperate for answers, Alex returned to the auction house where he had purchased the painting. The auctioneer, pale and reluctant, revealed that the painting had been sold multiple times before, each owner reporting strange phenomena before eventually abandoning or destroying it. Breaking the curse, determined to break free of the painting's grip, Alex delved deeper into Lavelle's life. He discovered a journal left behind by the artist, hidden in the archives of an art collector. In it, Lavelle confessed to a horrifying act. In his grief and rage over his wife's and daughter's disappearance, he had dabbled in dark rituals, seeking to bring them back. Instead, he had trapped their souls in his final painting, along with his own, binding them to an eternal cycle of torment. The journal also hinted at a way to break the curse. The painting had to be burned at the place it depicted the cursed landscape itself. Armed with this knowledge, Alex set out to find a real-life location of the painting. The final confrontation. After days of searching, Alex arrived at the desolate countryside that matched the painting's setting. The river was now a shallow, lifeless stream, and the oak tree stood twisted and barren. With the painting in hand and a can of gasoline, Alex prepared to set it ablaze. As he struck the match, the painting's figures came to life, their ghostly forms emerging from the canvas. The man and woman screamed in anguish, their voices merging with the mournful wails of Lavelle himself. "You can't save us," the man's voice bellowed, the air around Alex growing colder. The curse is eternal, but Alex refused to falter. He lit the painting on fire, the flames licking hungrily at the canvas. The screams grew deafening, the air crackling with energy. The oak tree seemed to sway violently, as if resisting the act. Finally, the painting was reduced to ashes, and the land fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the landscape seemed to breathe once more. For the first time in days, Alex felt at peace. Epilogue. When Alex returned home, the whispers and shadows were gone, but the experience had left its mark. He sold off most of his collection, vowing never to purchase antique art again. Yet sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Alex would hear faint voices, and in his dreams, he'd see the barren oak tree standing alone in the mist. While the curse was broken, the memories of the portrait of tragedy would haunt him forever.